Thanks to Red Sparks Union, thanks to all of you, and thanks to Suzanne. Before I begin, I just want to echo Suzanne's remarks regarding the fact that this event and all of the work that we do is taking place on unceded Indigenous land. And so when we're speaking about occupation and resistance and liberation struggles around the world, the first and foremost liberation struggle on this land is the struggle of Indigenous people to defend their land and for full rights and for sovereignty and self-determination. And it's incumbent upon all of us to support that. And when we look at the legacy of Canadian settler colonialism, it's a legacy of violence, of oppression, of eradication of people, of confiscation of land, of violating human rights, of destroying the lives of children and families. And these are the kinds of descriptions that we commonly hear associated to the term terrorist. But terrorist is a word that's only applied to non-state actors, and terrorist is a term that's not applied to looking at what the Canadian state itself or the US state, because we're going to be talking about some US laws as well, have done on this land and continue to do not only on this land, but around the world through imperialism. And so to recognize that as we're struggling against the listing and the terror list and what that means, that we're also struggling against settler colonialism on this land as well. And of course, the use of words like savage and brutal and dangerous and subversive and terrorist is nothing new. It's always been done by those in power against those who do not have power. And it's always used mechanisms of media and the state in order to popularize those terminologies, in order to glorify settler and imperial violence while demonizing popular violence in the name of resistance, defense of rights, and resisting occupation, oppression, colonization, and injustice. The fact of violence itself is not what's being interrogated when people talk about terrorism. It's not a question of violence, and it's not a question of public safety. If it were a question of violence, we'd be looking at the actions of the RCMP, we'd be looking at actions of the Canadian Armed Forces, we'd be looking at the actions of the US Army around the world, we'd be looking at drone strikes, and we'd be looking at F-16s dropping bombs on Gaza. But we're not looking at those things. And instead, there's a moral panic creation, a categorization and labeling of resistance, of guerrilla struggle, of popular liberation movements, of people claiming the right to resist as immoral, beyond the pale, and unacceptable. And so when we look at the use of the term terrorism as the primary term that's used to describe opponents of imperialism, and particularly opponents of imperialism from the US and Canada, it's something that's emerged in the era of the unipolar world, the post-Soviet era. In the era of the rise of anti-colonial movements, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was a strong campaign to defeat these movements, either by co-optation to support the order of the United States and to become part of the US imperial order, or to violently destroy those movements. And those movements that were subject to attempts at repression and destruction were labeled communist, Soviet-aligned, under the Iron Curtain, or subversive. But the propaganda was very similar to today's anti-terror rhetoric. Movies were made about troops of armed Sandinistas invading the United States from Texas. Not to mention the language that apartheid South Africa used, and that was used by its defenders in the US as a bulwark against communism in Africa. But post-1991 in the post-Soviet world, the US sought to establish itself as the reference for all international affairs, and US imperialism as the reference point and the defining point for international law, international justice, and any sort of foreign relations. Some examples of this included the creation of the Middle East peace process, what's been called the Oslo Process in Palestine. And the Oslo Process in Palestine is extremely problematic. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it involved the United States attempting to set itself up as the reference point for the future of Palestine, while at the same time remaining the leading state sponsor of Israel as a US client state. And in order to do this, it created these listings and the casting of those who refuse to be part of the U.S.'s creation of a so-called peace process while being involved in waging war as terrorists and state sponsors of terrorism. Now, state violence, as we've noted, has always been legitimized until it is delegitimized by the listing of a country that rejects U.S. foreign policy as a state sponsor of terrorism. And we can see that those countries that are so labeled really has very little to do with who sends arms around the world, who's involved in the arms trade, who's selling arms. If they were involved, we'd have to look back at the US as the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, but instead have to do with those countries that resist US foreign policy. And the terror list itself is a list of organizations that resist the domination of US and Canadian imperial control. Of course, banning groups, organizations, and movements are nothing new. The Israeli example is relevant here, if only because there are so many Palestinian and Arab organizations on the terror list, which is a list that's created by the Israeli military. It can be added or changed or edited by military order of the Israeli commander in charge of the West Bank at any given time. Thousands of Palestinians have spent years upon years upon years in prison for nothing more than the conviction of membership in what's called a hostile or a prohibited organization. And this includes nearly every student union, women's organization, labor union, and social group in Palestine, because to be a union in Palestine of any group means to stand against occupation and stand against Israeli apartheid. And just as the lists in the Israeli state creates are used to describe not only armed organizations or political parties themselves, but a whole range of affiliated groups, charities, social societies, unions, and mass organizations, that's been the case in practice as well. Most of the time when people are imprisoned or prosecuted for material support in the US or facilitation of terrorism in Canada, no one's alleging that they've written a check out to one of the organizations on the list, but rather that by supporting some charity or social movement or mass organization, that therefore they are indirectly providing material support. So to return to the issue of the Oslo Process, the reason why I raise this, even though we'll be hearing more later about Palestine in detail, is that this is the genesis of the terror list. And I'm talking about the US's terror list because all of the ones that followed were patterned on the legislation that was established first in the United States. The Oslo Process, many of us have seen the pictures of Rabin and Arafat shaking hands on the White House lawn. This was being heralded as an era of peace. If we look back 20 years later, the failures of Oslo are well known. There are 3 times the number of illegal settlers. Over 5,000 Palestinians are in prison. Over 7,000 have been killed by the Israeli military, the creation of the apartheid wall, the building of settlements, and it goes on and on. And at the time, we all know now Oslo was a failure. And we all say that, Oslo was a failure. But at the time, there were courageous and strong and quite a large number of Palestinian voices who stood against Oslo and said that we as Palestinians are not going to provide legitimacy to the colonizer by recognizing its legitimacy in its theft of our land and its continued destruction of our people and our resources. And what was the purpose of Oslo? It wasn't to support Palestinians, create a Palestinian state, or bring about peace. If it were a way of bringing about peace, it certainly has an interesting way of doing that, because it certainly brought about war, and it's brought about intifada in return, in exchange. It was an attempt to establish the U.S. also. For many times, even though it's been quite problematic, the United Nations was seen as a reference point for the future of Palestine, and that UN resolutions should guide this process. But through the Oslo process, we weren't even talking about the UN anymore, as problematic an institution as that is. We're talking about the United States as a reference point for international law and international justice in Palestine, while every day it was giving $10 to $15 million a day to support the state of Israel and its occupation. And it was also an attempt to create a Palestinian authority to co-opt the Palestinian national movement into a subservient junior partner that would benefit individual political or financial interests, but not benefit the majority of the Palestinian people. And so in January 1995, we saw Executive Order 12947 in the United States, issued by President Bill Clinton. And the people that this list targeted were those who disrupt the Middle East peace process, which was defined as an emergency situation for United States national security, foreign policy, and economy. And almost everybody that you see listed here There's the listing of just jihad, which I'm not really sure what organization they were attempting to define by that name. Other than that, there's one Lebanese organization, one Egyptian organization, interestingly, 2 Israeli organizations, and we'll talk more about later. But the rest of them are every single Palestinian political party that was called part of what was called the Rejectionist Front at the time, who had announced a political position against the signing of Oslo, whether or not they were involved or actively engaged in military resistance. And so Kahana and Kak are listed, and these are racist, right-wing, kind of infamous Israeli organizations that called for the transfer of all Palestinians out of the West Bank and Gaza, the continued ethnic cleansing of Palestine, not really much different than what the Israeli state was already doing, but putting it into words and also, violently attacking individuals, much like we see from the settler movement. These organizations, however, were the most marginal of the Israeli right wing. And no one's ever been prosecuted for supporting these groups. But what they did do, even though no one's ever been prosecuted for this, and people talk about their support for Mayor Kahana, both in the Israeli government now and certainly like at events in New York and whatnot, this has never been an issue, and it's never even been a controversy. In fact, the same people who have proclaimed their support for Kahana or their admiration for him have called for Palestinians and Arabs to be prosecuted as terrorists simply for saying that Palestinians have the right to resist occupation. No one's been prosecuted for this, but what this did do was an attempt to say, oh, we're against all sides who challenge the peace process. Okay. The law that followed this was the kind of law that became the basis for anti-terror laws in Canada as well, and that was the Antiterrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. What we know about this law is that, by its name, we can kind of take the sort of law that it is. It's a law that was created to make the death penalty more effective and to suppress people's right to file habeas corpus claims or to say that they were wrongfully imprisoned. And what it also did was create a completely new category of criminal prosecution in US law, which is material support. And this is very similar in Canadian law to what's called facilitation of a terrorist group or facilitation of terrorism. It's much more broadly defined in US law. It includes any property, tangible or intangible, or a service, including lodging, training, expert advice or assistance, facilities, and then we get to weapons and transportation and whatnot. The US Supreme Court has actually ruled that this could apply to trainings on human rights and international law or how to support people to bring their case before the United Nations, and that theoretically someone could be prosecuted for material support on that basis. In Canada, we have facilitating terrorism, which means that you participate in or contribute to, directly or indirectly, any activity of a terrorist group for the purpose of enhancing the ability of any terrorist group to facilitate or carry out terrorist activity. And so there's also a longer definition of terrorist activity. This is more restrictive than the US definition, it should be noted. It should also be noted that the RCMP has referred cases to the United States to be prosecuted there of people who hold Canadian citizenship for material support that has any connection to the United States, because the laws there are stricter and because the sentences tend to be longer by terms of 10 to 15 years longer than average sentences in Canada. And these lists in Canada were created in 2001, the same time the list was created in the EU. The UK version was created in 2000. So who's on the list? It's everyone from national liberation movements and revolutionaries to general resistance groups and reactionary organizations like Al-Qaeda. They're all non-state actors. State terrorism is rendered invisible. And placement on the list should not in and of itself be considered to speak to the political nature of the group, except that that placement is in some way beneficial to US or Canadian or EU imperial interests. So being on the list doesn't make you revolutionary, but being on the list certainly doesn't make you a terrorist either. And so why create this list? Well, it's not a rhetorical device. It's not a symbolic creation. Why did George W. Bush say we will starve the terrorists of funding? Because it impacts exile communities. It maintains imperial power. It supports US and Canadian hegemony. It supports racism and settler colonialism. Now, within exile communities, it has three primary impacts. The repression of exile communities, the spreading of fear, intimidation, and political silencing. When you can be prosecuted for supporting the national liberation movement of your country and your homeland, That's a strong pressure. It helps parents tell their children to not get involved in politics. It helps people say, let's not engage in solidarity work and let's not speak about this outside the home or outside the community because of fear, because of intimidation, because of silencing. And this comes with CSIS knocks on the door, and this comes with FBI knocks on the door in the US. Separation of exile communities from their liberation movements, so that exile communities here are forced to be working and organizing separately from their communities elsewhere around the world, and a constant and legitimized pretext for the prosecution of community and solidarity movements, because these laws are so broad and so vast that they could really be used at any time to prosecute anyone who's involved in struggles that are about supporting national liberation. And it's only people's organization and people's willingness to resist that prevents them from doing that at any given time. And so it has these three impacts at home. But when we look at also, it's not just the impacts that happen here inside the US or inside Canada. This also has an impact on the politics of national liberation movements themselves. Because we must ask ourselves, what groups are most impacted by the loss of funding from grassroots communities? Palestinians are, for example, an exile community. In 1948, when Palestine was occupied, over 750,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes and lands and properties in a process of ethnic cleansing. Today, there are over 6 million Palestinian refugees around the world in exile. Many of them live in North America, in Latin America, in EU countries, in places targeted for terrorist listing. Those Palestinians are an integral part of their nation, of the national liberation movement. And those grassroots communities have always been part of supporting that movement. In fact, in Palestinian cases, they've involved millions of dollars sent to charity organizations, sent to schools, sent to women's groups. The Palestinian leftist organizations used to raise millions of dollars every year in the United States before the existence of these laws. These laws shut that down. So the question becomes, who can find other funding and who can't? So it's the reactionary organizations who can find other funding. It's the reactionary and right-wing organizations who can go to Saudi Arabia, who can find billionaires and millionaires and other countries that are willing to fund their movement, to fund their organizations. But leftist and progressive and revolutionary organizations don't have that opportunity, won't find that funding from wealthy countries, and won't find that country from servants of imperialism without these laws upon them. It's those organizations that are most impacted, and so it becomes a method of political pressure and political attempts to suppress revolutionary movements, not only to defund them and to starve them, but also, more than that, to change their politics, to inspire them to change themselves in order to be delisted, to not go outside political parameters in order to avoid loss of funding. This is the purpose of the terrorist list. It's both to suppress exile communities here, but also to transform revolutionary movements around the world into either invisible and shadows of their former selves, or to subservient organizations that are co-opted by US imperialism. And there are some examples which we don't have time to get into now, but I'd be happy to talk more about that later. And so it becomes incumbent upon us to say, if we want to make sure that there's a future for revolutionary movements, if we want to make sure that the only political options that are available to people around the world are not just those that are acceptable to US and Canadian imperialism, but are those organizations that are supported by their people in their countries who are engaged in struggle and by their exile communities and solidarity movements around the world, then we need to say that those who resist cannot be criminalized, and that these laws will be resisted, and that these laws will be struggled against, and that we refuse to accept them as legitimate classifications, and that we refuse to accept that the US and Canadian states, while perpetrating terror around the world, can define anybody as a terrorist, and that we look instead at those who resist as liberators, revolutionaries, and inspirations, not terrorists, and that we'll do our best to bring an end to the state terrorism that's being inflicted upon them today. Thank you.